back.
Okay, everyone, we're back for our final guest today here in the Go Local studio, the Navigate Credit Union Broadcast Center. Very pleased to be able to talk again with Dr. Terence Roehrig from the Naval War College, an expert on the Korean Peninsula who I had the opportunity to talk with back in March, just around the time that President Trump, I believe, had said North Korea was behaving badly, but here we are now, April 14th, very heated relations in the region, and wanted to just pick the brain of Dr. Roehrig as to what he's seen these past couple of weeks and how things have gotten so heated. So, Dr. Roehrig, thanks for Skyping in today.
Oh, my pleasure, Kate. Nice to be here.
Well, talk to us again. Let's just maybe play out after we had spoken in March. Did you anticipate something like this coming to the level that we're now at?
Sure. Let me also just preface my remarks by saying that these are my views only and do not represent the U.S. government, the usual caveat I need to offer. But I suppose it was not entirely certain we were going to get to this particular place, but the threats and counter threats have continued to ratchet up tensions in the region. It certainly is not the first time we have had this type of level of tension, but it is definitely higher than it has been in past days and in past years as well, and certainly concerns in regards to that. And I think one of the ways to look at this is that everyone is trying to deter everyone else from taking actions that they don't want the other side to take.
Okay.
On our case, it is testing. On North Korea's case, they want to make sure that this isn't some perhaps forthcoming invasion on the United States or South Korea's part.
And talk to us about the timing. There's been a lot in the news about North Korea and their celebrations this weekend. Is that of concern?
Sure. Yes, and I think that's perhaps why the timing is coming to a head at this particular point. On April 15th, which is actually that day in Korea, because they are 13 hours ahead of us, that is the anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birthday. And Kim Il-sung is the first leader of North Korea. There are only three, and they are all related, grandfather, father, and currently his grandson, Kim Jong-un. And Kim Il-sung's position in North Korea and his sort of rank in the political hierarchy and esteem of the North Korean people is difficult to overestimate. He is considered almost godlike to North Koreans. And so his birthday is probably the biggest holiday in North Korea. In the past, they have often tested missile systems and other types of things. They have had a major parade every day at this particular point. And so we watch very closely to see if North Korea is going to test anything sometime around this particular date. There have been reports that their nuclear testing facility is, as one report said, primed and ready to go. And so that is the main concern that we are watching for currently, is that North Korea may conduct its sixth nuclear test sometime in the next day or so. And we are also watching this parade very closely to see if there are any new weapon systems that show up. They generally aren't actual weapons, but they are mock-ups of potentially new missile systems. And so we are watching these next few days with great concern. But the key issue has been that the Trump administration said that if a nuclear test is perhaps imminent in the next day or two, they might consider conducting a military operation to preempt that test. And that is of great concern to many who follow Korean Peninsula issues.
Mm-hmm. Do you, as you said, the administration, the Trump administration, is making overtures that this could be possible. Do you take into account the recent military actions taken by the Trump administration? I know your focus is on the Korean Peninsula, but taking action in Syria with the missile strikes, again, taking action in Afghanistan with the mother of all bombs. Is that something, as you look at potential to take action in Korea, does it look, is the new president more active, in your opinion, than you might have anticipated?
Sure, and I think some of those actions have been a bit of a surprise, but not entirely so. certainly North Korea has noticed these things, and that the United States' willingness to use military action in the case of Syria and Afghanistan got a lot of people's attention. Mm-hmm. But I would caution that Korea is a very different situation than Syria and Afghanistan. First of all, the Korean theater is an area where we are involved in an alliance with South Korea. And so this is not simply about the United States taking unilateral action. Mm-hmm. This has to be done in conjunction with our alliance partner, South Korea. And they are concerned that unilateral action might be taken without them being consulted. Their government officials have said that they believe that they would have the ability to sign off and veto any particular action. And so that's an element that is very different. The other key piece is that the vulnerabilities on the Korean Peninsula are very different, again, from Syria and Afghanistan. Seoul is very close to the north-south border, and the North Koreans don't need nuclear weapons to retaliate against Seoul. They can use conventionally armed rockets, artillery, to be able to hit the capital city, which is estimated to have a population of around 25 million in the metropolitan area. And so there are many vulnerabilities and serious dangers about using military force on the Korean Peninsula that are less present in Syria and Afghanistan that make this a much more dangerous theater of operations for the United States to use military force.
And what, in your opinion, would happen? I know we talked about this a little bit before. If North Korea were to use, as you say, those conventional methods of warfare and areas within the region, and the United States and South Korea were to retaliate, again, talk about the escalation potential here. You know, would they, in your opinion, would the United States take a very drastic measure against North Korea, given especially the rhetoric back and forth between the two countries? Or, would they, do you think, take a more isolated approach to, say, take out power structures?
Well, and of course, these are the big questions. And let me walk this back a bit. First of all, if the North Koreans were to test, I'm not absolutely convinced that the United States would respond with military action, because, again, of all the things that I have outlined, I think the Trump administration understands that there are very serious dangers. But if the United States were to conduct some sort of, and I would assume it would be relatively small-scale military operation, then of course we have to wonder how North Korea would respond. Mm-hmm. And I'm not suggesting that they would necessarily respond by targeting Seoul, although they certainly could. But this is where the question is, how would these kinds of events escalate, and would this begin a process that would lead to higher levels of escalation that would bring a war to the Korean Peninsula that frankly no one wants to see, because, again, of all the vulnerabilities. And again, I'm not suggesting that we necessarily get to that, but if you start down that road, then things become far less predictable and far more uncertain of where we end up as we start to move down this ladder of escalation.
And we talked a little bit as well about the current presence of the United States, as you said, working with their alliance with the South Koreans and doing spring exercises, which they have done every year. How much of a current presence do we already have there?
The United States currently regularly has about 28,500 troops on the Korean Peninsula. That number has gone down over recent years, but that has been the current amount for the last, 7 or 8 years, and is likely to stay that way. We have some combat units there. We have some air units based in Korea, but the exercises are also designed to practice as well as to demonstrate that if something worse would happen on the Korean Peninsula and deterrence would fail, which again, of course, we are all hoping, and that these efforts are to ensure that deterrence does not fail. But if it were, that the United States is prepared, has worked with its South Korean allies to be able to flow forces into the Korean theater, to be able to defend South Korea, perhaps to move north if that were necessary, depending on what the situation called for. And again, these exercises are these sorts of regular rehearsals to make sure that we are able to do that. But also to demonstrate with a deterrence message to the North Koreans that we can and will do this, and therefore they will not try anything in the first place. And again, the deterrence will hold and we can maintain peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, because again, no one wants to see war in Korea.
And you had mentioned that number, that 28,500 troops. The reports that additional sort of naval capabilities from the U.S. have been moved over there. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. We had the Carl Vinson carrier battle group, which had been headed towards Southeast Asia, was turned around and brought back. The Carl Vinson participated in these exercises earlier, a month or so ago. So it's not unusual to do this, to have an aircraft carrier as part of this. It is part of the signaling that we are demonstrating to the North Koreans that we are bringing this kinds of combat power to the area, again, to try to deter the North Koreans from doing anything. I'm not entirely certain that if we responded, it would even necessarily use assets from the carrier. I think it's much more likely that you would see Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from destroyers that are already present there in theater. But this adds again to the signaling, to the message to North Korea that we are there to defend our South Korean ally, and that therefore do not try anything to disrupt peace and stability in the area.
And we've talked about the role of South Korea and the United States' alliance against North Korea. Talk about other players in the region, China, other Asian countries. When, if anything, does this have the potential to draw other countries in?
Sure, I think China certainly is a key player to this. I mean, the key player in addition to the United States and the two Koreas. And it has been interesting to see over the last few weeks China's position. There perhaps are signs that China may be more willing to take actions, in particular in the area of sanctions, which I think is the much more likely route that the United States and others will take in response to North Korean testing. But with that said, that I think there have been some indications that maybe China is willing to tighten the screws a little bit more in regards to North Korea, but I think a good deal of that remains to be seen. But China would not be pleased if there were military actions taken, because again, I think this is a key piece to what China sees as its main goal in the region, and that is maintaining stability. That would be a concern for them, and I think how the United States, China, and South Korea react to this and how this plays out, I think is a key issue. Let me add one other piece to this. I think South Koreans are very concerned that this has become, over the last 2 weeks, particularly with Trump and Xi Jinping meeting and discussing regularly these issues, that somehow South Korea has perhaps been sidelined from this process. And this has become a China-U.S. show, and that would be very disconcerting to South Korea if there were actions taken and they were not part of this. They feel that this absolutely is their area of concern. This is a Korean issue first and foremost, and that they expect to be consulted and to be part of the issue as China and the United States work to solve the North Korean problem.
And how much of a role does the South Korea have against sort of these, two superpowers in the U.S. and China, if they, in fact, as you mentioned, perhaps could or do end up getting left out? Do they have any recompense?
Well, certainly, if the United States wanted to act alone, if China wanted to act alone, they could certainly do that. But on the U.S. side, that would be very, very damaging to the alliance, because we talk often about the elements of going together, about joint planning. And I think that the United States and South Korea have to do this together. When the alliance does not consult with each other, and when the partners do not work together, I think those are times when the alliance does not function as well as it should and could. And so I think it is absolutely essential that the United States work together with South Korea. And I actually trust that I think that is going to happen and will go on. But the optics, as you have seen again over the last couple of weeks, have looked like this is a United States and China show. And I think the United States has to work very hard to make sure that that is not what ends up happening, and that we continue to work with our South Korean partners in moving forward in any actions.
And one of the things we discussed last time, new leadership in South Korea with the power change there. Talk about those implications.
Well, that has been a very interesting and difficult backdrop for South Korea, and feeds into some of perhaps the China-U.S. narrative. South Korea's president has been impeached and removed from office. She is now in jail and awaiting trial. South Korea will be conducting an election on May 9th to fill her position. They have had an interim leader up to this point, and so many have been concerned that this power vacuum in South Korean politics has been part of why South Korea has not been able to be as strong of a player in what has transpired over the last couple of weeks. That, of course, will be taken care of in May when the election occurs, and that we will see how that leadership perhaps becomes more of a key player in this. But it's also interesting to see how the election is being impacted by this, and the candidates as well. One of the candidates, Moon Jae-in, has talked in the past about perhaps reaching out to North Korea, and has been much more of a willingness to dialogue with the North. The other candidate who has, at least up to this point, not been very strong, has moved up significantly in the polls, An Chol-soo. And the debate about national security and how to deal with North Korea has been very interesting, as Moon has backed up a little bit in regards to his positions, but how they will deal with North Korea, how they will support the alliance and be an important player with the United States has become an important part of the election.
And how does that fit into the U.S.-South Korean alliance if a new leader is more open to dialogue with North Korea? If the United States is the third point on that triangle, how does that play out?
And that's a very interesting and could be a difficult issue as we go forward. For many Koreans, they see the alliance as the linchpin of South Korea's security. And if there, and for the past 8 years or so, the United States and South Korea have been very close alliance partners, have been very much on the same page in regards to dealing with the North. If the next South Korean administration starts to see things differently in relation to North Korea compared to the United States, that could create some difficulties in alliance relations and create some challenges that the leadership on both sides would have to work through. I'm not necessarily certain that's going to lead to very difficult relations in U.S.-South Korean ties, but it certainly could and will require some important maintenance to alliance relations. But it's a question mark that we'll have to see in the months ahead.
So, as we talked about earlier in our conversation, obviously a big weekend in North Korea with, again, the April 15th day of celebration there. Is this a real pivotal moment to see what transpires tomorrow, this weekend, and then sort of reassess following?
Absolutely. I think it is going to be very interesting in the next couple of days. You have seen both sides lay out some very important deterrence postures, if you will. Well, deterrence, if nothing happens, that's good, because then deterrence has succeeded. And we don't have to question necessarily what follows next. And so if nothing happens, then we shall see if North Korea has decided that they don't need to test, or they have decided to push this back down the road. Because, of course, while we are very concerned about the parade and the celebration coming up, they don't necessarily have to test tomorrow or the next day. It could come later. And so we have to see. But I think one of the things to keep in mind, that if North Korea, and I think they are, devoted to building a reliable, effective nuclear deterrent, they do have to test these systems to make sure that they work. And so I think it's very likely that you will see some tests sometime in the future, but it may not be this weekend.
Okay.
And it may be sometime down the road, but we will have to see.
Well, I appreciate picking your brain today, Dr. Roehrig. You know, as we said, we talked back in the middle of March where things looked very different. A lot has happened since then. And again, your expertise at the Naval War College, so appreciate your taking the time to Skype in. Anything else you want to add today to any of the viewers?
No, I thank you very much, and just keep your fingers crossed for the next few days.
Well, but we're keeping all eyes on it. And again, as I said, appreciate getting to get your perspective from the Naval War College. Dr. Terence Roehrig, an expert on the Korean Peninsula, we'll let you sign off, and we'll talk with you soon.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks.